I'm just happy to get right into it. Thank you very much for inviting me. So this is going to be a little bit of work in progress. So there are some fairly rough edges, but there might be some interesting things to build on. And Rob and me are really interested in hearing your comments. So I'm doing this together with Rob. He's a student at the Hero Center for Practical Ethics, and he's doing this daring thing of working on a PhD dissertation that's on a critique moral enhancement, while having Julian as his advisor. And we ended up getting into an interesting conversation a while ago, a little bit about interdisciplinary work. So this is going to be unusually light on the philosophy and have other elements. But basically, if we think about the standard moral enhancement discussion, it's typically based, as we have heard earlier, about is it right to do moral enhancement? Maybe what kinds of moral enhancements are possible, or even which ones are acceptable because of the needs. But quite a lot of these ones are also based on rather theoretical considerations, kind of ignoring individuals. This is very similar actually to a lot of the cognitive enhancement literature, where we have been very happily talking about, should the students be allowed to take memory enhancement? Here we think about them as individuals, and maybe there is a context where the interplay is important, but typically it's all about individuals. One of the interesting things I actually noticed when working on that paper about love enhancement was that complicated the picture quite a lot, because there's at least two people involved as well as the bigger context. And thinking about the social aspect of enhancement becomes much trickier, especially if you're trying to do good ethics of it. I think we have pretty decent ethics for reasoning about individuals and the context, but when you start getting groups, especially groups with non-trivial structure, things get rather complicated. I noticed this when I was trying to write a paper about should we cognitively enhance politicians. And I felt I had a really good case for this paper, and then I spent a week in Parliament, and then I tore it up, because it turns out that actually individual decision makers don't do that many decisions. It's much more a collective phenomenon, and the kind of enhancers I had in mind were much better than that. Deeply unlawful. But if we now think about moral enhancement from a social perspective, what came up was that John was worried that if we start enhancing ourselves as a society, we might destabilize society. Basically, our societies function because people both have a diversity of moral culture, but also some of these structures inside society might be predicated on things not changing. And if we allow these to change, maybe the society becomes unstable. So we started working on a little model of this. So basically, our vision is that you can go to a store and buy pills that act as moral enhancers. So this is all about voluntary moral enhancement. I'm not going to get into any discussion about free will is or anything like that. Let's just assume that you can go to your local drugstore and buy altruistic pills if you want to. And somebody might want to take it, or somebody might want to take an antidote to altruism. So the point is, now when people start freely choosing their preferences, what happens? So one assumption we made is that there's always some people trying anything, which is generally true. Another thing is that when people are trying to choose what to enhance, or when we're trying to see what preferences we should get, they're going to have some mechanism for doing that. And a very likely one is that they try to imitate successful people. What constitutes success here is an interesting question. We also base this on the work on social value orientation. So basically we have been playing around with game theory. In game theory, of course, normally you have a payoff matrix like this in the Prison's dilemma, and you get some scores depending on what you and the other player selects. And normally in game theory, this is all that happens, because people are assumed to just want a high payoff. But in practice, many people, of course, care what happens to their opponent. Quite a lot of people actually like outcomes where both get an equal amount. And this has been analyzed in social value orientation theory for quite a long while. Also worth mentioning that actually would everybody want this kind of enhancement? my favorite paper ever about the enhancement attitude is Rees and Simmons and Goodwin's paper about the preferences for enhancement, where you can see that quite a lot of the students they asked were willing to enhance wakefulness and language ability, but only 9% wanted kindness enhancer. I vividly remember Julian shouting, "They're wrong!" when he saw this diagram for the first time. And maybe he's right, but it seems to suggest that we might not want to. Not too many people might want to enhance it. However, 9% might be willing to do that. So there might always be a minority. And of course, quite a lot of us actually do have ideas about that we should better ourselves more on. So I think we can be fairly certain that some people will be using almost any more of an answer or disenhancer. Okay, so what we do is we have these games, but then instead of looking at just the direct payoff, which could be in terms of money, or it could be something else, we have an evaluation. So in the slightly awkward terminology of social value orientation, we call the first one vitality, and the second one satisfaction. Satisfaction can be regarded as a subjective experience utility. If I play a game against you and we both do really well, if I'm very high on wanting equality, I'm going to feel really good even if we didn't score as highly as we could do. While somebody who is a perfect homo economicus would instead be very annoyed if he didn't get the highest score. Now, in this literature we have various social value orientation. It's typically a combination of one's own outcome and others. So the traditional economic model would be a pure individualism in this terminology, where you only care about your own outcome. A pure altruism in this terminology would only care about the other's outcome. So an altruist playing the prisoner's dilemma is probably going to try to have the opponent, the effect on them while they compare, so the opponent gets as high score as possible. But you can get other interesting combinations like pro-sociality, where you care about equally about yourself and others, and the more pathological cases like sadistic, where you don't care about yourself, but you really want to know the score of your opponent. Or the sadomasochism, where you really want to make things as bad as possible for everyone. These are rarely observed, but when you do service, you find occasional weird reduction. Typically, humans tend to be somewhere between individualism and cooperation, and some people are more altruistic. This is, of course, not just a stable trait, it depends a lot on context. There is also maximum and negative. Some people are competitive and want to maximize the difference in score, even if they might get a low score. Others are trying to get a more equal outcome. So my model is very simple. So we have about a little society of agents that have these different evaluations. And then we play games against each other. Either the prisoner's dilemma or just random games. We have tried various social dilemmas. And then we get objective payoffs, which they then convert to have satisfied the outcome. And at the end of running a lot of these games, there is an overall evaluation of, okay, how are the other agents that have done much better than me? In that case, maybe I should become more like them. This is where you can do a lot of very fun, different options. So one is just to select another agent randomly and see, is he much happier than me? In that case, I should become like him. On the other hand, sometimes if a sociopath is really happy, but I don't want to be like a sociopath because I have very distant value, maybe I should adapt it. So one can also do a model where you base it on the distance. So you update more strongly for agents that are like you or have compatible. One can even do a very elaborate one where you evaluate every single interaction, not by what the agents involved will have offered, but what you think is right. So you might see the sociopath playing a game, but you evaluate them according to maybe your egalitarian outcome and estimate how happy they ought to be according to your rights. So this way you get a population that change. And finally, we remove some agents that score too low on objective. The reason why this is interesting, this might be hard to see, but if you just run this, you get the two possible attractor states of the society. One, which I would call the nasty one, which is kind of mainly in the sadomasochistic direction. So the agent starts playing, and they more and more of them try to just break things. And this one shows the overall payoff, and it's going down, and it becomes stable. Meanwhile, the satisfaction goes up. It's a hellish work, but since the people in it are so crazy that they like having a nasty work, they're very comfortable with this. On the other hand, you can also get an opposite one, which is dominated by the pro-social and individualistic and altruistic agent. So in this case, the correlation between the payoffs and satisfaction are possible. So these two are equivalent as long as you don't remove agents that have an actual low objective payoffs. Because in the real world, if we just try to make everything as bad as possible, society would of course not survive. That's one reason why we don't see too many people who actually have this truly pathological motivation. And it doesn't take that much asymmetry between these ones to make the pro-social attractive state actually quite stable. And it's not very far away from what we normally see as psychological studies. So one can play around with this, but then we get to an interesting question that if you start with the normal neuron but allow this more enhancement, we find that the amount of pro-social actually goes down, we get more of these type of pathological effects. So Joao, he was concerned that if we allow moral enhancement, we're going to have a breakdown of society. It turns out that this relatively nice attractive state is stronger than that. But we do get a reduction of pro-sociality and a tendency towards individuality. And this depends a little bit on how strongly we drive this with this kind of poverty. So if we imagine a situation where it doesn't matter how much you score, in that case, it might be hard to see, sorry for that, but too many dimensions there. Then the pro-social one actually tends to dominate. But as you make the society harsher, the more and more agents just starve to death if they can't get enough score. It doesn't matter if you're very happy with your low scores because we have some elevation. Then we see that the individualistic agents become more common. So this is a kind of generic effect. One can of course play around with the prison's dilemma, and we see, again, this interesting case where you collapse into states where people are not doing their work, everybody's cheating everybody else, and then occasionally you get these bumps going up to the high corporation states. And it's an interesting thing to observe because if you look at the satisfaction, you find that when the society shifts over to the cooperative nice state, a lot of agents are getting very unhappy. They actually have fairly negative rules which worked well before, and now when society is changing, they think it's actually turning worse. In this simulation, of course, they adapt. But we might think about a real society where we might say that, oh, we need to have political agenda to make sure that everybody cheats everybody and those darn corporators don't dominate. One can even do a more detailed analysis. I don't have the time to get deep into it, where you actually think about sitting down in the room and rationally trying to evaluate what we ought to have given. If I change my value function, what value function should I have? It turns out that maybe I'm not an altruist, but I might find that with my current value function, if I were an altruist, I would actually reap good rewards, as I regard them right now. So it turns out that in this case, the pro-social state is actually quite stable for very many different games, including random games. So basically, the pro-social agent is going to state that it doesn't need to change. While the individualistic agent will actually learn, if I became a bit more altruistic, I would actually get higher score, as measured by my own individualistic standards. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, it seems that actually we didn't trash society very much by having more enhancement, but there are these dilemmas between individualism and pro-sociality that still needs to change, because even a small change there might change us from a high trust and low trust society. We also, it turns out to be fairly robust results. In the end, it seems like emergence in a society might actually be an important problem to think about for moral enhancement. Even if we have just the ethical problems, and if we resolve them, we have other issues that the stability might actually be complicated, especially when you start thinking about groups. That's the next step we're going to work on. And to conclude, in computer science and programming, you tend to talk about the mean time between failures. Some bugs show up every day, some bugs show up every month or every year. And in order to find them, you need the people testing the system longer than the mean time between failures. You can learn what this is why it's good to have a lot of beta testing. The problem with testing and something in the society is that we only got one copy of it. So that means that we actually need we might have a hard time seeing the transitions, the mean time between failure, so to say, for more advanced regimes might actually be long enough that we might walk into some trust. Well, thank you. That was it.
We're going to actually proceed with the papers and then take discussion of all three papers at the end. Try to maybe take a note of your questions, so all the questions don't go to the last paper. And Professor Damjanović, would you like to?
Moral enhancement, affective disorders, treatment via dilemmas. I'm professor of psychiatry and I'm a director of clinical psychiatry in Belgrade. So here are some outlines of my presentation. Today I would like to discuss something about affective disorders, which are characterized by depression, mania, bipolar disorder, dysthymia, and schizophrenia. Also, I would like to discuss something about dual character of morals and morality in affective disorder. Also, I will talk something about biological basis of morality as a determinants of affective disorders. I will mention also some moral action within the affective disorders between doctor and the patient, and some contemporary ethical and bioethical dilemmas in affective disorder. So, how we bring some ethical or moral decision? We know that the knowledge of ethics does not automatically result in a moral behavior. And all models of moral decision making face the difficulty to explain something familiar and common. So I choose the theory of mind. The theory of mind is a part of a very complex process. And what that means, theory of mind? That means that the ability to recognize mental states, our own and other people's, and also the ability to understand that others may have some beliefs, desires, which are different from ours, which are different from some cognitive, emotional, and behavioral point of view. So, is there any general biological basis of morality? So, temporal-parietal connections to the left hemisphere have a very important role in distinction between I and the others, and in the theory of mind, basically in the process of empathy. So, neurogenesis in dental health is also important and has a very important role in genesis and anxiety and depression. And also, we have very significant influence of emotion on the process of decision making, such as the influence of cultural factors that support or discourage our action. So, what is empathy? Empathy is a kind of contagion by emotional expression of others. As you see, the newborn is able to imitate the facial expression of adult 1 hour after birth, and after 6 months apart, pro-social and anti-social behavior. What's about gender and gender roles? In a woman, the stronger activation of amygdala, we have a stronger activation of amygdala in different types of empathy. That's especially evident during the follicular phase, confirming a possible hormonal effect on empathy and therefore affecting ability of mood in women. So, the system of mirror neurons, which are located in premotor cortex, is responsive to the ability to recognize and imitating other people's emotion and affective interaction. Mirror neurons, as you see, respond to when someone does something, when someone sees another person to perform an action, when someone hears a description of the situation, it means someone performed an action. So, the empathy and the mirror neurons are obviously the room for moral improvement. As you see, mirror neurons respond without our will automatically. They are identical to the other neurons, but opposed by a large number of synapses that can multiply during the life of an individual. Like the old characteristics, human resource, this is not the same among all men or women. So, except the mirror neurons, our brain has a lot of compartments with some neurotransmitters. And the role of neurotransmitters in affective disorders and morality are, for example, serotonin in the process of empathy and euphoria, also depression. Noradrenaline has a role in the process of depression and anxiety, and endorphins in the process of anxiety and fear. After all these facts, what's about the role of serotonin in moral behavior? We know a lot about that because there are numerous studies and articles about application of antidepressant, especially citalopram. And we know that the persons under the influence of high levels of serotonin are prone to more moral choice and avoid causing direct harm to others. Also, they are prone to increasing the likelihood to acceptance of an adverse effect. So, probably, the damage of empathy and morality is a consequence of lack of serotonin in affective disorders. How serotonin promotes pro-social behavior? By increase of capacity to control emotional impulses that lead to social aversive outcome to hurting someone, and also by increased emotional response to the expected aversive outcomes. So we also have two pathways of pharmacological modulation of human behavior. Direct route, bottom up, which involving neuropeptides, oxytocin, vasopressin, and which promote pro-social behavior, and indirect route, top down, which involving serotonin and which limits antisocial behavior by increasing aversion to harming others. So we have also some functional interaction between these two pathways. Affective disorders are broad group of mental disorders, as you see, that affect 10 to 20% of general population, and the depression and bipolar disorders are clinically most important affective disorder and significant cause of disability. So, there are a few very vulnerable fields within moral judgment and bioethics. For example, evolutionary adaptive potential affective disorders, diagnostic, pharmacotherapy, discreteness, and right to life and death. So what's about evolutionary adaptive potential affective disorders? Some traits or characteristics of affective disorders is in the general population in attenuated form as adaptive ability. What that means? Our affectivity contributes to the survival of species. For example, cyclothymic temperament is very important because maybe it's a creator of creativity. Also, depression or melancholic or amphobic temperament was very important for the preservation of mental energy. Hyperthymic temperament is important for the process of communication, progression, and leadership skills. It's a very interesting field for me. It's a field about affective disorders and creativity. It's a field in which we can see some kind of border between illness and adaptability. And as we know, mental disorder is more common in close relatives of creative people than in creatives themselves. Exception is writers who themselves have high rates of many disorders such as schizophrenia, mood disorder, anxiety, drug abuse, and suicide. and we know that Virginia Woolf suffered severe depressive episodes, finally drowning herself. Also, is it moral to treat all affective changes? If we understand health, emotional, and evolutionary basis of affective disorders, all these things emerge some bioethical implications for treatment, and also emerge some moral and bioethical dilemma. Where are the limits of normality, and how much or how can we influence the adaptive potential of personality? Here are the basis, biological basis of morality. We know for the amygdala and cingulum, zones of the brain which are involved in emotional regulation, and the key mediators of neural function that modulate fear and anxiety are the amygdala and limbic system with cerebrospinal system. So the projection from the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to amygdala through the frontal cingulate cortex are very significant, because these regions facilitates connection between harmful behavior and distress of victims. There are a lot of structure and functional changes in a patient with bipolar disorders. As you can see, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, hippocampus, all these parts of brains are involved in a process of morality and empathy. That is very important. So, what's about profile of moral reasoning in person with bipolar disorder? Here are some articles from the Poland authors, and they divided their subjects in 3 groups: bipolar patient, remission, bipolar depression, and healthy subject. And as you see, bipolar depression patients are less prone to post-conventional opinion, weaker to overall assessment, right versus wrong, and patient in phase of mania significantly more prone to immoral procedures compared to the patient in euthymia and healthy subjects. So, after all these facts also promote some problem of informed consent in research with the patient of bipolar disorder. So, can pharmacology help enhance human morality in patient with affective disorders? Yes, of course. With mood stabilizer, we can control impulses in bipolar disorders. With antipsychotic, we can control psychotic patients. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective in the treatment of this kind of patient, and so on and so on. We can also use serotonin, oxytocin, vasopressin, but there is a long way from social neuroscience to clinical application. So, I can say, without one's altruistic desire or need to change its own behavior to help protect the environment, the drug remains only a tool on the road to moral improvement. Okay, here are some creativity and evidence-based treatment. Medication remains the first line in treatment for patients with bipolar disorders, and there is growing support for augmentation of psychopharmacotherapy with psychosocial treatments, and I will skip all this. So, here are some contemporary bioethical dilemmas, especially in the field of diagnosis of affective disorders. We have genetic testing, determination of biomarkers, which are important for diagnosis and prevention. We can also conduct some commercial tests that indicate the risk of bipolar disorder or predict response to antidepressant therapy. So, after all these facts, also emerge some pro and contra claims. Timely diagnosis, adequate therapeutic approach, prevention, anti-stigma versus reproductive decision, therapeutic choice, worry, and stigma. So, we know a lot about the biological basis for moral. We know a lot about affective disorders, and affective disorders have input to moral judgments. Also, after all these data and facts, emerge some bioethical dilemmas about moral in affective related disorders, and also implications for the therapy and favoring adaptive potential with this kind of therapy for bipolar patient. And the last but not least important, somewhere along Albert Einstein, the morality is nothing divine, it is entirely a human thing. Thank you very much for the attention.
And could I invite the next speaker? Yes,
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give the lecture. The topic is serotonin reactivating inhibitors, SSRIs, and moral enhancement of conscience. Of course, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a clinical pharmacologist, and my talk will be from the point of view of clinical pharmacologists. We know that historically medications and surgery have been used to control behavior. A number of drugs are prescribed for respiratory effects. For instance, disopyram, as well as anti-androgen drugs for chemical castration of sexual offenders. It is argued that the use of drugs for these purposes may exert control of the mind of the users. Drugs compromises must compromise or may compromise their freedom and undermines personal autonomy, which is very important for medical studies. And the subjects drugs can subject people to the physical changes caused by those effects. And more urgent issue is that medications used on a larger scale they can affect cognition, emotions, and judgment. Antidepressants are widely prescribed medications and can influence moral decisions. SSRIs are drugs prescribed for the treatment of depression and a wide range of anxiety disorders. This type of drugs block the reuptake of serotonin, as mentioned by Damjanović, in the presynaptic nerve terminals, thus increasing the activity of serotonin in the synapses. SSRIs, I should point out, the third most prescribed class of medications in the United States of America, after analgesics and liquid drugs. And we know that SSRIs have effects on moral behavior. Two types of games are used to describe the influence of SSRIs on behavior: dictator game and alternating game. And it should be pointed out that serotonin promotes pro-social behavior by enhancing harm aversion. In this paper of molecular, the influence of serotonin was described. Serotonin, the title of the paper was Serotonin Selectively Influences Moral Judgment and Behavior Through Effects on Harm Aversion. This is critical from this very interesting paper, and we see effects of drugs and offer failings of rejection rates in the ultimate game. Citalopram reduced rejection rates of their offers relative to both setting and placebo. Thus, represent twice the standard level of difference in this. In another paper by Wood and colleagues, effects of tryptophan depletion on the performance of an integration is still again carefully others investigated. In healthy human volunteers, either tryptophan, which is serotonin producer, or not, tryptophan depletion produces significant reduction in the level of preparation shown by participants in the game when playing the game on the first, but not on the second study phase. These data suggested that serotonin played a significant role in the acquisition of socially competitive behavior in human adult participants. We can connect SSRIs and antisocial behavior and concerns about morally negative effects of SSRIs and behavior that have been widely discussed and still remain controversial. Despite the number of legal cases related to SSRIs and violent behavior, research on the association is limited and, most importantly, inconclusive. Ecological studies suggested that increased SSRI prescription can be associated with increases in violent crimes in the United States of America and with lethal violence in the Netherlands. The limitations of those studies are numerous. First, findings from ecological data fail to relate to the use of SSRIs at the individual level and are liable to be influenced by legislation, reporting of violence, and the impact of other risk factors such as consumption of drugs and alcohol use. Pharmacovigilance is a part of clinical pharmacology and is defined as science and activities related to detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects or any other drug-related problem. Pharmacovigilance data have shown a disproportionate association between SSRIs and violent behavior and serious violent acts. We know that SSRIs have many adverse effects, and common adverse effects of this type of drugs are prominently there to induce sexual desire or erectile dysfunction, drowsiness, insomnia, and so on. And we should point out that the potential side effects of antidepressant equals violence and worsened depression. In 2004, FDA revised the labeling requirements for antidepressant medication, SSRIs included, warning that antidepressants increase the risk compared to placebo of suicidal thinking and behavior in children, adolescents, and young adults, or in short studies for major depressive disorders and other psychiatric disorders. Anyone concerning the use of SSRIs or any other antidepressant in a child, adolescent, or young adult must balance their risk with clinically. These labeling provisions were in large part driven by legal actions in which pharmaceutical companies are forced to reveal previously undisclosed data. Psychoactive drugs are drug class and association with violence are shown here. This is taken from the paper of New and colleagues from 2010, and I didn't put this paper this slide impress you, but to show that antidepressants, for instance, were setting and have very high percentage of violence. Limitations of pharmacovigilance studies are numerous also, because we can have reporting bias, changes in patient awareness about the outcomes, confounding by indication, and failure to account for exposure to other medications. Pharmacoepidemiological studies shown that the association between SSRIs and violence outcomes are as follows. In a very nice paper by Novero and colleagues from this year, cohort follow-up study, this study shown that the risk of violent crime is determined when an individual is taking an SSRI as compared to when the same person is not taking that type of drugs. Time-invariant factors, for instance, genetic factors, all factors before the start of follow-up, and factors that remain constant during follow-up are accounted for. And main findings of these papers, which was published in one of the best journals, Prostran, are as follows. Confirmation of the association between SSRIs, prescription, and violent crime. Convictions. With age certification, there was an increased hazard of violent crime convictions in individuals aged 15 to 24 years, and no significant association with older individuals, which is very important. The association of SSRI treatment with violent crime was not found for moderate or high SSRI use, including in those aged 15 to 24 years. We know that SSRIs, widely used group of drugs, have the following effects, such as selective confirmation of personality and social behavior by serotonergic intervention. Serotonergic intervention affects both social dominance and affiliative behavior. Serotonin modulates behavior reaction to unfairness, and serotonin selectively influences moral judgment and behavior through effects on harm reduction. But no reason has been taken to suggest that potentiating serotonin increases aversion to directly causing harm to others. In conclusion, or should I say, instead of conclusion, it is not clear whether the effects of these drugs on moral decision-making and behavior are on the whole positive or negative, and I should point out the fact, as a clinical pharmacologist, that this type of drugs has so many interactions with the and we should think about it. Thank you.
Now, our speakers have all been very diligent in keeping to the time that I asked. All three speakers have to drag their chairs forward, and we'll take questions. Would you like to? So, for any of our speakers, it's an unusual silence. There's been such a sort of extensive discussion of the issues.
Well, actually, the idea was to have Harris Wiseman here, who for some fortunate circumstance, and he actually could have added to Professor Prostran's talk on the adverse effects huge listing of jurisdictions, and for instance, data that show that I don't know how many, but a significant number of cases, serial killers, so people who went into school and killed, for example, children, events in the US and elsewhere, that they were either with SSRIs or the kickoff phases of SSRIs, so he has, for instance, extremely negative opinion about SSRIs as moral enhancers. Okay.
That actually raises an important question. How do we know a moral enhancer is as good as Sandberg today? So in my talk, I was just making up, I just assumed we had these pills and they could do it. But in practice, when we get over to real psychopharmacology, things never work out that nicely. And in the general enhancer debate, quite a lot of people are taking enhancers and are using the placebo effect rather than an actual enhancing effect. So there might be a problem if we develop moral enhancers that there might sound promising. There might be articles in New Scientist about how this is going to make us all moral. But actually, just like the SSRI are debated as applicable for various forms of depression, it might turn out that actually there's an awful lot of placebo moral enhancement. Maybe if we're all eating sugar pills and behaving more nicely because of that, that's kind of a totally perfect outcome. But the risk is, of course, that we will be eating sugar pills and getting side effects, both moral and physiological side effects.
Professor Prostran, can I ask you a question about your description of the malaria paper? So the one that the paper you were discussing, the penultimate section.
It was a nice topic study with a lot of patients, and I think everyone should read it very carefully. But I would like to make a comment regarding the SSRIs, because I mentioned in one of the slides that SSRIs are the third prescribed drugs in the United States of America after analgesics and lipid-lowering agents. They are prescribed, this type of drug is prescribed for clear indications. But I should ask Damjanović, are patients who are taking SSRIs are morally enhanced?
From case to case, don't have any conclusion, but there are
They're widely prescribed.
yes, there are right, but there are a lot of very controversial data about treatment with SSRIs, especially for antisocial disorders. So we don't have any consensus yet.
It's more a comment to read this collection, a nice collection of the very different kinds of effects of SSRIs, and these very, very different evaluations of either maybe something contributing to violence or maybe something improving pro-social behavior. Does that show us how careful we as philosophers have to be when we talk about enhancements, moral enhancement, on the basis of drawing on scientific literature, where we often, let's say, go to the literature that may be salient, that may have received more headlines, rather than actually having a real in-depth understanding of the combination of what is known about the area. I just find that's something that sometimes literature seems to just draw on use rather selectively and draw on quite a lot of conclusions on that. I think it's quite nice to see that if you go with it more and that should not be more complicated.
I think it's actually quite useful to get these weird surprises sometimes when you read the real literature. My favorite example is oxytocin, which first seemed to be rather boring. Oh, it just makes you more altruistic and nice and cuddly. And then we found that, it also increases in-group parochialism. You're much nicer to your in-group. Who is in the out-group, that is very individual, depends on the culture. But suddenly it became not just that it got the dark side. It's actually philosophically much more interesting. Would be now regarded as a moral answer. And probably the answer is no, we don't really want too much in-group parochialism. In fact, something working against that might seem to be a little bit. I didn't have a chance to get into my talk, but I do think that finding ways of actually enlarging your in-group might be a way better way of being more enhancement than social value orientation.
I would like to comment on the suggestion that perhaps the philosophical literature has misused the literature from psychiatry and pharmacology because, we typically cite only studies that show something interesting, and then the real-world studies seem to show much smaller effect sizes, much less strong.
I don't feel adequate to discuss philosophy. I'm unaware in that field, and I know psychiatry to the extent that I can incorporate my clinical pharmacology and knowledge into it.
But I think that it's very interesting what's about relation between creativity and mental illness people. For example, Hermann Hesse was treated with psychoanalytic therapy, and after that he was better. But vice versa, Eugene O'Neill wasn't better after this psychoanalytic therapy. So it becomes very interesting what's about medicaments, medications, relations.
We have questions here.
Yeah, it's a different topic, different issue. I was interested in the statistics that Andres showed at the beginning of your talk about people being asked what they would like to enhance, right? And the moral enhancements very low on the agenda and cognitive enhancement. Very high. I just thought about it, and it seems to me that actually explains why voluntary enhancement is not going to work. And it makes sense because moral enhancement of morality is much more personal than the cognitive. If I'm not very bright, then it makes sense for me to want to be brighter, right? But if I'm not very kind, then I'm not the kind of person that wants to be kinder, right? If I don't care for justice, then I'm not the kind of person who wants to be more just. It's just not my kind of thing. So cognitive enhancement and moral enhancement are asymmetrical. The one is personal in a way that the other is not. Just a thought.
I completely agree. I think it's an interesting case. That survey looked at how fundamental different traits were regarded as the sense of self. It also demonstrated that framing could have very big effect. So if you express the enhancers as be who you really are, people were really happy to take it. But be more than you are, now people were very skeptical. They didn't want to share who they were. And even that thing about justice, so in my model, that incomprehensible diagram, the square diagram, that's kind of an impossible situation that somebody would sit down very carefully and calculate, I don't care about justice, but if I were to care about justice, I get more money. And then this is what I currently care about. So in the future, I care about money and justice. That's of course not how it actually works, except maybe in philosophical thought experiments. In the reality, I think we are doing imitation to a very large degree.
So here,
Maybe I have two questions. One is, Sandberg, I became quite interested in know more about the methodology. You presented a study, but I don't know if it's one or two, because fast, and the methodology of the study of the.
So it's a computer simulation. It's an agent-based model, as we call it. So I have these little simulated agents that are trying to do what makes me happy or what makes sense to me. So it's not a study on real people out in the real world. It's a study on little computer people in So you shouldn't base too much on it. It seems more as an argument.
Could we repeat what we referred from the results of the
So it seems like the pro-social approach, where you actually care about yourself and others more or less equal, I think there is a very simple mathematical reframing of this, which is almost trivial. But it has to do with the fact that if you just try to maximize your own payoff, that your opponent, the other actor you're dealing with, might be doing something that doesn't. But if you're trying to maximize your payoff and the other actors, then you're a bit closer to each other. It's much more likely that you will both succeed, at least to some partial extent. So that is something that probably drives a fair bit of practice. There are, of course, loads of other research about why cooperation emerges. This is just a very simple case. What really intrigued me was actually that it works also for random use, not just the Christian dilemma and other social games, but actually when we just randomize the entries in the matrix, I've never imagined there was enough structure for that to work. But I'm happy to talk more about
Sorry,
that.
we've got another question. Did you have a second?
No, I have a question to them. I can't wait.
Damjanović, so do you want to ask your second question, and then our second speakers here, and here?
Okay. This is for them. It's for psychiatrists. It's the problem of what we are treating. For example, SSRI are used to treat psychiatric disorders, for example, mood disorders. So I'm a physician too, and when I discuss with my colleagues, the discussion is which disease you are treating, what you are treating. And so, for example, mood, maybe a person is sad, but it does not necessarily be treated. So this, I think, I make this comment because I think this can eliminate some distinction between enhancement and medicine. And I'm not sure about that, but for example, if there is a drug that can modify mood, an acute sense mood, I'm sad, it's not good to be sad, maybe. And so this is not a point of medical treatment. Psychiatrists usually think like that. For example, if they are treating a disease, a chronic disease that has consequence in mortality, morbidity, and disability. And so, what do you think? For example, we don't have, for example, evidence that SSRI medications modify mood in this sense of mood that is, I'm sad and I do not want to be sad anymore now. But we can good evidence that we modify the chronic disease. No?
I don't know what to say, because when we talk about enhancement, we suppose that the person will take drugs for a certain period of time, long period of time, not acute, and short period of time. And in that sense, we don't have clear data regarding dosage, the length of duration, and finally the outcome.
We treat at least our patient with 6 months for the decision. They can maintain therapy.
Yes, this is for Professor Sandberg. Regarding the methodology, it's just building off the last question. How would you distinguish between a moral enhancement and other sorts of?
So this is where I would love to have Joao here, because he's the philosopher of the team, and I would have kind of tried to get him to ask that question. So I'm not certain this is really a model of moral enhancement. Some definitions of moral enhancement would of course claim that it is because it deals with your relationship to other people and whether you're happy when they're happy and doing well or something. So this is much more low level. This is just looking at how the agent actually regard the other person. So generally, of course, we tend to hand wave and say altruism is moral, which is not true because we don't want altruistic methods. They're not moral activities, and the fact that we work very well together is not a good thing for society. So I wouldn't stretch it. So it's related to moral enhancement because we're interested in understanding what happens to society when you can change your preferences for interaction. But it's a very simple thing, so it's nothing compared to what we have been discussing earlier.
Yeah, it seemed that when I was hearing it seemed to be utilitarian or strict consequentialist model or not. There are other kinds of ethical views that wouldn't be able to fit that.
So there is a really fun little paper I told you before where I was playing around with the prisoner's dilemma, where you have agents that could have much more complicated internal rules. And he was studying, could you develop what he called police agents, we would say altruistic punishment, agents that are willing to sacrifice a bit of their payoff in order to maintain justice in their society. And there are some very interesting computational issues because it's surprisingly tough even to keep track of who ought to be punished. And is the fellow police agent also sufficiently just in his behavior? I don't think, I think it's too complicated for this current investigation. But I'm happy to investigate it more in the future.
So, this is also more of a comment, but I'd like to get your reflection on all of you, but particularly the contributors, Mr. Sandberg. The question with your study of the sort of how the moral drops, to low end, there's a strong capacity of self-delusion, I think, among people, particularly when it comes to their moral identity, right? So, if I'm not that bright, I kind of recognize that, because of course I have all these peers around me. Okay, yeah, I wish I were smarter. But it's much harder, I think, for people to admit, I'm not that good, right? And I think maybe where moral enhancement might have an inroad in a very freedom-preserving way, to go back to earlier discussions of that, is to import something like Frankfurt's concept of first and second order desires. So if I have a sufficient if I have a second-order desire to be a certain way morally, and I'm self-cognizant enough to say, okay, my first-order desires are not in line with that, then maybe I would be more willing to admit my acratic fault and to take measures to fix it. So this is more open for comment on that concept.
I completely agree. I think becoming better able to control your behavior and desires so that they are in line with higher order desires. That's probably a really promising way forward. But as you started, most people think that's very good enough. So we might be having a real problem here that most people in general think that they're good enough. Then of course we can rattle off a long list of cases where they have been eating more than they wanted to, really. And they have a long list of actions that they actually can remember, yet they don't then see that as evidence that they actually should be updating behavior. So maybe what we need is a moral enhancement that makes us aware that I'm not as good as I thought I was. Unfortunately, I think the closest to that is kind of depressive realism, but that's not very nice.
It works from the Augustinian perspective, as someone noted earlier.
Here.
I wanted to comment something on Michael said. I think rephrased.
Could you speak up, please?
He rephrased. Do you hear me now? He rephrased something I also think I said here, that those who are most in need of moral enhancement will be the least likely ones to embark on it, and that is why voluntary moral enhancement is difficult. I agree with that under the condition that we justify moral enhancement, or that ultimate harm prevention is the justifying rationale for moral enhancement. But I don't agree with ultimate harm being the justifying rationale for moral enhancement, as persons are led to believe. For instance, I think that there is an interest for people to be moral. Not because other people will necessarily be good to them because they are good. Frequently, yes, but that does not necessarily have to be the case. But if you behave like a nasty person, People will not behave nicely, then will have fewer friends, you will have fewer people who will help you. Then when you describe people around you and say, okay, this is a guy that is, he is immoral, this one is stupid, this one is nasty, then you don't feel good. Even when you talk about events and you have a completely negative approach to them, you don't feel good. So there is an interest for you to be good and moral in certain to a certain degree and in certain forms. I'm not trying to dogmatically defend the position of so-called voluntary moral enhancement. Actually, I nuanced my position a lot during the years and months. But my point is basically that the justifying rationale for it should not be ultimate harm prevention, but something else. The other thing that is important, I'm very confident that as we know where the loci of morality are in the central nervous system, and as we know which neurotransmitters do what, which molecules do what, it is highly likely that in the future more relatively efficient moral enhancements will be developed. I would be really surprised if that were not the case.
Very briefly, the question.
One other question.
Still take it, please.
Okay, thank you. So I have two short questions related to the kind of clear connection that are brought to us here with altruism, fairness, morality, and antisocial behavior and affective disorders and the SSRIs. So first of all, if this connection is that clear cut that we've been presented right now, I'm also kind of implying that that depressed and people suffering from anxiety disorders are very bad at being moral and fair and altruistic, because I don't think that that kind of goes with the symptoms of these diseases. And the second question is that, as we've been told, the SSRIs are the third most eaten medication in the state at least, and I think also in other Western countries. So wouldn't that imply that the third of the population should already be like really moral and fair and altruistic, because almost half of us is already eating them? So why are we not yet moral then, or beyond moral, something like that?
Only person with some clarified disease, such as anxious disorder, are eating the pills. So no healthy people. That's the truth.
I asked so a question about people who are taking SSRIs and cancer. But I would like to ask Dr. Sandberg, if we want to test ourselves, for instance, what type of games we should test? Is it possible to propose certain type of games?
Yeah, so these economic dilemmas, there is an entire industry of papers in various groups looking at different settings, looking at different manipulations. There is actually a quite nice set of them by now, especially since the prisoner's dilemma is one of those really complicated cases where you kind of have a cooperative and effective strategy, and you tend to overthink it. A lot of different factors come into play at the same time. So what happened in game theory was that people started splitting it into ultimatum games. Typically, it's one person who makes the decision, and only one person. And this is much more clear-cut. So you have things like you get a certain amount of money, and I offer you a certain fraction of it, and you can choose to accept it. Then you get it. We can say no, and then we don't get anything. So there is a nice set of these games that one can look at. There is a very nice data. People, of course, been trying to give oxytocin to the people that run these games, trying to see exactly what happens. So it's quite interesting, and it's also slightly revealing when you actually end up in a game situation and realize that you actually need to make a decision. It's one thing to know in theory what you should be doing. Another thing when you actually have the money or the cash or whatever it's you're paying around.
And may I add something to be clear? I recommended and prescribed the SSRIs only to the people with the symptoms of anxiety, depression, not all people. So that's the point. That is a moral enhancer.
Yeah, but actually the question I think is still valid. If so many people are getting SSRIs, and if we have moral effects, shouldn't we be seeing bigger effects? And I think we can conclude, given the fact that Americans have not changed their morality that fundamentally in any direction, that the effect size of the moral enhancement of SSRI is relatively weak. There might be some rather subtle effect. In my own work on love enhancement, I noticed that SSRIs actually can be fairly bad for relationships.
One of the most serious adverse effects of SSRIs is aggressive behavior. So.
Yeah, and it also has to do with some of the more loving emotions. Again, there are interests, but notice that we don't notice that there is some. People tend to ascribe whatever is wrong with American marriage to everything but SSRIs, and they're probably just a small fraction of what is causing trouble in American marriages. Yet, I think they are there, so it might be that we have widespread use that does have moral effect that we don't notice. We might have marriage effect or violence effect, but they blend into the background.
Some questions here. I would like to ask a question as well. Feel free to add yourself to this.
Just in response to watching and to the other discussion we had earlier regarding the asymmetry between the desirability of cognitive enhancement and the desirability of moral enhancements. It's not merely that we usually think we are good enough, it's also that cognitive enhancement is self-benefiting primarily, whereas moral enhancement is other-benefiting primarily. In other words, my becoming smarter is good for me, but my becoming more moral is good for you. Right? And is it not? Well, I'm getting back to what you said. Primarily, right? That's what morality is. It's not about benefiting myself, it's about benefiting others. Okay, now of course I can think in a particular situation, I can realize my being so nasty all the time doesn't really benefit me, right? Because I don't have any friends and so on and so on. So I can form a second order desire to become more moral in order to fit in more and so on. So I'm realizing that this is against my self-interest. But just as well, I can, just as easily I can realize that being as moral as I am is against my self-interest. I'm always too nice to people, you're too kind, you're too trusting, so on. I realize that, right? So I form the second order desire to become less moral. And that just, and that is, that both is just as likely. Shows really that moral enhancement is not something that is very likely to be done voluntarily.
Just a very short comment, very short one. The same we can say about cognitive enhancement, because it does not necessarily serve you. Are smarter people necessarily happier than most stupid people? I'm not sure.
The evidence seems to be that being very smart doesn't necessarily make you happy or unhappy. You're all over it. The being dumb, that generally tends to make you unhappy. So there might be a threshold effect that you want to be involved with a stupid threshold.
Other evidence shows that in postmodernity, not only society as a whole, but also our individual identities are risky projects. That is not only because we live in sort of disenchanted world, but also because the project of rationality also fails us to understand some of the atrocities of the 20th century. So I'm wondering whether that quest, or maybe I should say meaning
it again, but this time using some biotechnological. That's just my thing, my thought. I would like to share with you that I'm curious what you see of it.
I think it depends very much on how you come to moral afterwards. So, Julian's ultimate harm argument, which was very much triggered by me and Prostran chattering about cognitive enhancement of the singularity all around the office and scaring him rather seriously when we realized what happens if you have a sociopathic charge of singularity. That in many ways a very rationalistic approach to it. We want to avoid navigating the story, we need an instrumental tool to do. So there is no enchantment in that reasoning. On the other hand, if we actually think that why can't we all get along? That sentiment that we actually do as humans, we should strive to be nice, excellent beings, whatever it is. That seems to be really more like, maybe we could find a different help us do things.
I think that we should think clearly between the cognitive enhancement. I'm not a very conservative and I rather talk cognitive enhancement, but rather very much skeptical about moral. That's my point.
Because it's a false that can re-enchant the world.
So moral enhancement, not cognitive, but moral enhancement seems to be a kind of that attempt at enchantment that could be very, very dangerous, as many jobs are.
And you've been waiting very patiently.
This might be less of a question and more tossing a little torch into the SSRI discussion. I've been wondering about the relative dearth of epidemiological studies on the association between SSRIs and violence. And being Swedish, which is sort of being an enchanted country when it comes to registers, we keep registers of everything when it comes to patients. I happen to know of a study that was published just a couple of weeks ago in POS Medicine, where they have access to individual level data of 85,000 individuals, and they actually find a robust association between SSRIs and violence, that there seems to be a significant increase of violent crime among people who are prescribed SSRIs. This was published just last month.
I know for that I completely agree. Previously said that there are a lot of side effects of SSRIs, especially aggressive behavior violence.
I might use the privileges of the chair here to remark. I mean, it's kind of striking that if the third most prescribed drug in the USA, which is widely touted in the moral enhancement literature as a great moral enhancement, A doesn't seem to generate any noticeable effect, and B hasn't been studied very much except in the context of violence. I'm curious about thinking, this is another observation about the enhancement literature, is it's always very kind of new drugs. Okay, so people don't think about alcohol as a moral enhancement, you know, or cannabis as a moral enhancement. And we've got an enormous evidence base that at least some uses of those drugs actually generate pro-social behaviour. For instance, now too much and you get antisocial behaviour. But I mean, there's something going on that people always look to the kind of the sexy new sort of pharmaceutical, and they don't look to all the other drugs that human beings have been taking for a long time and say maybe we should be all sharing a glass of red wine with our parents, or maybe we should all make ourselves happier by using heroin. So I'm kind of curious about, are either of you aware of any sort of evidence base around positive uses of alcohol or cannabis as an example that you might plausibly re-describe?
I don't know what about cannabis and alcohol, but I can recommend from my point of view as a psychotherapist, I can recommend modafinil. It's relatively safe
fairly short piece though. I mean, if you think of what people were saying about the benzodiazepines, for instance, you know,
The mechanism of action is different.
do you have any further questions?
I just would like to make a comment regarding cannabis. In many countries in Europe, cannabis registered for pain therapy, cancer pain, and some it's not cancer therapy. And for instance, so-called human derived from non-sex
Eric? I just wanted to point out that at least at work in the conversation for a very good reason, a very particular conception of morality exists. And so for example, when Michael says that moral enhancement would be about how we treat others, that seems to be particular, as does the claim that, well, SSRIs haven't made us more moral because we aren't harming people less, for example. Both of those seem to be important conceptions of what morality consists in, rather than not only. When you said to make your comment, Michael, I was thinking, first getting back to Aristotle, and not Aristotelian by any means, but again, for Aristotle to be morally clear is by no means solely about harm reduction or how I treat others. We find a morality or I will be happier.
I fully realize that. But in the context in which we are talking today about moral enhancement in discussion, this is clearly other benefit. We don't want people to be morally enhanced for their own sake, but for our sake. Right? These guys need to be enhanced so that we can survive. Right? We know what's best. They perhaps know it too, but they don't act on it. We need to find a way to make that
One of the big problems with the proposal from Julian and others to make us all more moral, the assumption is that the morality that we ought to embrace is utilitarian. Now, of course, there's much that can be said for utilitarianism, we're not functionally. But I would hope that we would entertain alternative conceptions of morality as well. And we'd be ashamed to leave them on the table. It seems to be happening. Because of the way the terms of the data is set by
Just to follow up on the last two comments, there was actually a study that showed up in my Twitter feed not too long ago, maybe a few hours, about utilitarian alcohol and kind of so they asked people some questions prior, and then they get drunk, and then afterwards they ask them the same questions, and it seems like folks get more utilitarian the more alcohol they have. And this seems to me, you look at this in two different ways, right? Well, that's not a moral enhancement, so not a utilitarian, that's actually bad. Or it is a moral enhancement if you are utilitarian, because now that I'm moral, but I think it speaks to exactly what you're saying.
That's a really fun result. I was also reminded about modafinil. Modafinil is not generally regarded as a moral enhancer, but it's sometimes people say, yeah, it might actually be more of a motivation enhancer, a cognitive enhancer. But from a practical standpoint, we don't care too much. If I can get a lot of work done because I'm highly motivated or slightly smarter, it might not matter in many situations. It might be that we also have this tendency in this discussion to assume, just like we talk about the perfect cognitive enhancer that doesn't do anything with motivation, it just makes your IQ higher. We might talk about a moral enhancer that has only effect on your moral cognition, which I think seems pretty unlikely, because one reason I don't do the moral thing is that I feel tired. So if you give me a stimulant, I would of course be more willing to perhaps do that extra thing. So I would be acting in a more moral way. I would be perhaps better in accordance with my own values, even though the stimulant was clearly what we normally do for a moral enhancer. So there might be something about the task specificity too, because modafinil also has some interesting effects on creativity. Highly creative people become slightly less creative, and low creative seem to become more creative. It might simply be that we need to start looking at the particular mental tasks or moral tasks and see what the enhancers are doing to them. that might be awfully impractical, of course, if you want just to generally enhance that, which is also just like we would like to take one pill and be cognitively enhanced, but unfortunately it seems that we need different pills for different mental tasks.
We have a scheduled break for cognitive enhancement in a moment. There's perhaps space for one or two more questions. Do you want to?
We can try, but the coffee will make us more efficient.
Would you join me in thanking all three speakers?
Are you